when we stood 4 years ago, and Ollie and I both headed up the list 4 years ago, we nearly won. We came within, 4,000 or 5,000 votes. We got 87,000 votes. We came within 4,000 or 5,000 votes of winning a place on the London Assembly. I came fifth as the candidate for mayor, beating the BNP and the Greens. The reason I raise this again is not because we know, and I'll come on to the problems that we've had and have in respect, but actually, if you look at the situation then when we stood, and you look at the situation now in London, things in London have got incomparably worse for the majority of working people in this city. If you look in terms of the transport, which is now the most expensive transport in the world, and despite the attempts to lower the fares with the Oyster card, still remains the most expensive. Even the reduced fares in London are more expensive than most full fares anywhere else in the world. If you look at housing, and today I've been in Tower Hamlets and in Leighton, you only have to look at the housing there to see what a terrible state housing is in, how they're continuing to try and privatise council housing, how the fact that they've pushed more and more people into buying houses, which they can't afford to buy. They talk about the crisis in America, the subprimes, where they lent money to people who couldn't afford to pay it back, but that's what they've done in Britain. When they lend people 5 or 6 or 7 times what they earn, that means people can't afford to pay it back. And it means that if they buy at the top of the market and anything goes wrong with the market, it goes down, they can't sell it without incurring a huge debt as well. This is a situation that we've now got ourselves into. But of course, it isn't just about housing and transport. This week, both main parties have said they are going to reintroduce the sus laws in London. Now, for anybody who remembers the sus laws, it meant that any group of kids, any group of black kids, because it was nearly always black kids who were arrested under these laws, any group of kids looking in a shop window, any group of kids hanging around Oxford Street or around Brixton Market or anywhere else could be stopped and arrested on the basis of suspicion by the police that they were going to commit a crime. Those laws were got rid of because there was a huge cry of outrage among the black community that they were things which were discriminatory and which were wrong. Now they're trying to introduce them back. And they're trying to introduce them back at a time when we've also had more and more of an onslaught on Asian youth. So young Asian kids are 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white kids are. Black kids are 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched. And that's under the existing laws, but we're going to introduce more in order to try to arrest more young people. And this is at a time when gun and knife crime has meant that last year 27 young people in London died as a result of gun or knife attacks. Now, either you can think this is because we have a bunch of youngsters who just want to attack one another, who just go around in gangs, who don't care about each other, or you can say that these kids and the society in which they grow up are a product of the Thatcher years, are a product of the Blair years, and are now a product of the Brown years, where they don't have an education that's worth anything, where they don't have schools that are decent, where they're told they don't have a future, where they're told they're worthless unless they cram more and more tests into their heads, and that's the only thing that counts for them. And no wonder that working class kids feel their failures even from primary school, because that's exactly how they feel. These are things which we are not dealing with. And the main parties either have nothing to say about these things, or what they have to say is the most reactionary stuff, because they really believe you should blame the victim. They really believe that the fault lies with working class families, with working class mothers in particular. If you're not married, of course, being unmarried must mean that you can't bring up your children properly, because this is what people are told, instead of looking at the society. And when you had Margaret Thatcher more than 25 years ago saying there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals and their families, that is why we've got to where we are now. That is why There is a breakdown in all sorts of areas. That is why people feel it is very, very hard to do. But there's another thing that happens, which is the inequality that goes on in London. London is one of the richest cities in the world, but it has some of the poorest people. The man who's the head of Marks and Spencer, Sir Stuart Rose, who's a very wealthy man himself, but obviously doesn't regard himself as wealthy enough, he said London is now so full of rich people, they are short of diamonds in the West End for the very rich to buy. But then he says the problem is there's lots of people who can't afford to go to Marks and Spencer's, and that's why Marks and Spencer's sales went down. Now, what is right about a city where people don't have houses, where people are sleeping out in the streets, where people are earning far less than the minimum wage, when immigrant workers are living, in one case in Hackney a couple of years ago, were living in a toilet because they had nowhere else, they had no house to go to, and therefore they would go into this public toilet at midnight and stay there till 5 in the morning. What is right about a society like that? And what is right about a society where I noticed today Shell, the oil company, announced profits of £13.9 billion. Now this has a relevance for London because there's a big argument among some people in London that the money that comes from Venezuela shouldn't be used to subsidise the buses for the unemployed. You know, at the moment, the deal that Ken Livingstone did with the Venezuelan government means that you get cheap oil which subsidises the buses. And the right wing argue that this is terrible because it discriminates against the poor people in Venezuela. Well, doesn't the profit of Shell at £13.9 billion surely discriminates against the poor people in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, all over the world? These people, surely these people should be able to run their own oil industry. This is what the Iraqis are demanding. We were told the war on Iraq was about democracy, but of course democracy never applies to the workers' movement, where they kept the anti-trade union laws just like they do in Britain, and they prevented them from being able to nationalise the oil. They're trying to privatise the oil. They haven't been successful so far, but that is what they are trying to do. And on top of this, all the things that we were told about London expanding, all the things we were told that the rich would get richer and that would trickle down to the poor and we would develop East London and all these other sorts of things, none of this has happened, and now there's a recession coming. So none of it is even going to happen, even in the wildest fantasy of Ken Livingstone and his advisors. None of this is going to happen. There isn't going to be the wealth trickling down. There aren't going to be the people benefiting from any of the wealth that has been created. And my argument about development in London is very simple. If we need to redevelop East London, redevelop East London. It's not rocket science. We don't need an Olympics which is going to cost 4 or 5 times as much as we were told it would cost. We don't want a situation when people in Newham are pushed out of the better areas in Newham, are pushed further and further out because that housing is being left for the rich. We don't want all of that kind of situation. So it's about creating a London for the people who work in it and live in it to be able to live decently. That's really what we should be standing for. And that is why we've got campaigning programmes about public transport, about council housing, about an end to crime, which doesn't deal with it just in terms of punishment, but which deals with it about preventing crime. That we want to be able to say, if we had the guards and the bus conductors, if we had the park keepers, if we had the caretakers, if we had the youth clubs, if we had a sense that our kids had something to do and a sense of worth that they had, or even if they had some sports facilities. When they built sports facilities in Newham before the Olympic bid, in order to get the Olympic bid, crime went down in Newham. As soon as they got the Olympic bid, they closed the sports facilities, and guess what? Crime goes up again. That's how it actually works. And we are saying that the vast profit that comes from the city, the vast profit that comes from the oil companies, the vast amounts of money that are in London should be taxed properly and fairly for the benefit of poor people and working people in London. That is what we are talking about when we talk about this campaign. And that means, it seems to me, that we need a left alternative. You know, one of the things we've always campaigned on is the war. And the war remains as important as ever. We have a demonstration on March the 15th. I believe it will be the biggest demonstration we've had for a long time. I believe that the appalling siege of Gaza, where people are being kept from having electricity and food, and they have to break through the border in order to get the basic things that we rely on every day, is galvanising people. I believe the Battle of Haditha, the film which is now on general release, which shows exactly how Iraqis live, will galvanise people. Most importantly, I think people believe the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq, they are both wrong and they should both end and the troops should be brought out. Now, on this, I agree absolutely 100% with Ken Livingstone. And there are other things I agree with him about as well. I agree with him on anti-racism. I agree with him against Islamophobia. I agree with him that he should have links with people like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And I agree with equal opportunities and all the things that Ken Livingstone stands for. But I'll tell you what, I still believe there has to be an alternative to the left of Ken Livingstone. And I believe there has to be that alternative for one very simple reason, that he is a little bit schizophrenic about his policies. That he has, on the one hand, he has these very good policies, but they don't cost very much, you know. Opposing the war doesn't cost a hell of a lot in terms of money. It doesn't put demands on the City of London. It doesn't build new houses. It doesn't build new schools. It doesn't do any of those things. And what we have to say is that what Ken does is good on the one hand, but going to the City of London, going to Davos, the disgusting meeting place of rich businessmen, which takes place in the Swiss Alps every year, and the nearest I've got to Davos was when we demonstrated, the anti-capitalists a few years ago, against the World Economic Forum, which happens in Davos. Ken Livingstone is there, mixing with all these people at the champagne receptions that go on there, because he believes that London has to get some of the crumbs from the rich men's and women's table. Well, we don't need to get some of the crumbs from the rich men's and women's table. We need to demand the whole loaf. We're fed up with them giving us crumbs. We want a decent living standard and all these kind of things. And of course, the trickle down might work when the economy is expanding, although it doesn't work even then. But it might, you might think it could work, and you might see how there is so much wealth in London, you might be able to get some of it. But actually, when the economy is contracting, when the house prices are going down, when the jobs are contracting, which is what will follow, already unemployment in some of the London boroughs is higher than the national average, especially among young men, and especially among young men of ethnic minority background. When all that changes, then it's no good even going to ask for a few crumbs from the table because they say we haven't got any crumbs. That's what they're saying about the pay freeze, where they are expecting public sector workers to accept a cut in wages, because that is what the public sector pay freeze for teachers and civil servants and even the police, that is what they are doing, that they're expecting them to take a cut in wages in order to maintain the profits of the private companies. That is what the pay freeze is all about. And we have to say we're opposed to all of those things. So when it comes to do we need an alternative to Ken Livingstone, yes we do. Not just because of his different policies, but also he's the Labour candidate. Absolutely. And a Labour candidate, as Ollie and Michael have said, a Labour candidate is tied to the Brown government. It's tied to the privatisers and the neoliberals. It's tied to the warmongers. And however much you distance yourself from that, however much you try to have an independent voice, you either have to support them or you don't. Which is why you have support for the privatisation of the East London line. Which is an absolute disgrace, really. I mean, upgraded up to a point, but then sold off as soon as they upgraded. I don't regard that as proper, decent public transport, and nor should anybody else. I don't believe that is something that Londoners should fight for. I don't believe it's right when Ken Livingstone then says that the RMT members should cross picket lines because they shouldn't be in dispute. He doesn't want them in dispute in the run-up to the Olympics because this will upset all the economic plans as to how the Olympics are going to work. So for all those reasons, I think we have to have a left alternative. Now, this is a controversial position, maybe not in this room, but it's a controversial position not very far from this room, and it's certainly a controversial position among some people on the left, who really believe, in the words of George Galloway, that it's a luxury that we can't afford. Now, anybody who thinks standing for mayor is a luxury, certainly standing for mayor for respect is a luxury, should think again. It isn't a luxury, but not only is it a luxury, is it not a luxury that we can't afford, it's essential. It's an essential thing for us to do. And you know, it doesn't cost anything. You would think from listening to these people that this was a first past the post election and that therefore me standing will split the vote. This is a dishonest approach to it. There are 2 votes for the mayoral election. You vote once and you vote twice, and you vote for your second preference. You vote for your first preference and your second preference. I argued last time that people should transfer their second preference to Ken. And I will argue that even more strongly this time, because I don't want Boris Johnson in City Hall. I mean, you may argue that Boris Johnson is a buffoon and is completely stupid. But let's not take the risk of finding out the hard way that he actually can do some of these things. So it's about saying we will transfer to Ken, and actually, if that works properly, not only won't we take votes away from Ken, we will gain Ken votes. I believe last time there were a lot of people who said, I'm not going to vote for Ken because I'm fed up with whatever it is. You know, I'm a taxi driver, and it seems to be a universal condition of employment for taxi drivers in London that they're fed up with Ken Livingstone, or people who don't like the congestion charge, or people who don't like him for 101 reasons. And we always argued, quite rightly, we should vote for Ken, as if it comes to a runoff between him and the Tory, we don't want the Tory to get in. I have no problem with doing that again, but I do have a problem with people who pretend that that isn't going to happen and that that can't happen. It can happen, and that was why the voting was set up in the way it was, so that people could vote for their first choice, but then they didn't have to see somebody who was extremely in opposition to them getting in if their first choice didn't win. And that argument is very important for us to put. A third argument that's very important for us to put is, of course, the whole argument that Ollie referred to about the split in respect. Now, I think those of us who were at the meeting last April know that when you have an argument like we've had in respect, when you have a division, when you have those people walking out, it doesn't make your life easier. It would be dishonest to say, OK, that's happened, and now we'll necessarily go from strength to strength. That won't necessarily be the case. But I'll tell you what, I don't think most people even know about this split, outside of a few thousand people, particularly the people who read the internet and the blogs and all this kind of thing, and who are on the left and all this kind of thing. When you go and talk to people in Leighton or Preston or anybody else, most people don't even know. In fact, I met somebody who gave me a leaflet from Cuba Solidarity the other day and said, please give my regards to George, obviously not knowing that that probably wasn't the thing that he would appreciate, or that I was about to do. Most people who are going to vote do not know there has been a split. It's not like the SSP in Scotland, where it was on every front page of every newspaper for weeks and weeks and weeks. It isn't like that. That's point one. Point two, we have to try to get up from the divisions that happened, the split that happened, and try to do what we can to win. Now, there are two barriers to this that I can see, apart from whether people vote for us or not. That's the big one we have to worry about. First is that George has announced that he is standing a slate, which isn't a respect slate, but which will include progressive figures on the left. Now, I have no idea what this is, or what it's going to amount to, or who will be on it. Personally, I think if it amounted to anything too great, we would have heard about it before the middle of February, when it's supposed to be announced. And if it's not going to be a respect slate, we have to ask ourselves what sort of slate it's going to be. And he's saying he's supporting Ken Livingstone, which was a position that he didn't take when he and I wrote an article in the Morning Star only 9 months ago, saying exactly the arguments that I've put just now. Now, of course, if George does stand, it makes it harder for us, of course, because, as one of the previous speakers said, there's not a huge difference, at least with some of the policies that we're putting forward. But on the other hand, it really depends what we do on the ground. Because it may be George isn't the only left slate. There may be other left-wing slates, as there have been in the past, as there were last time. The crucial thing is do we spend our time worrying about these people looking over our shoulders, or do we spend our time campaigning and organising and getting out on the streets and making sure that we maximise our vote? And I'll say this about maximising our vote. When we stood as a Socialist Alliance in 2000, we didn't stand a candidate for mayor because we backed Livingston, who was an independent then. We got 3.5% with Paul Foote heading the list, who was a well-known journalist, but who, on the other hand, didn't get a lot of publicity. When we stood in Respect last time, in many of the areas, nearly every area, apart from parts of South London, we got a higher vote than the Socialist Alliance. And in many of the areas, we doubled our vote. Because there was much more people willing to break with Labour in 2004 than there were in 2000. I think in 2008 there's much more people willing to break with Labour than there were in 2004. And that is the crucial point that we have to keep in the front of our minds, because that will determine whether we get a place on the Assembly, what our vote is and how we do. Essentially, it won't be about what the competition is, it will be about whether or not we can put those arguments forward. The second thing is, of course, the question that people ask, what is happening about the name? Now, George, no doubt to preempt this meeting, put out a press release today saying that the Electoral Commission had approved him having the name of Respect and that we weren't having it. Now, I have to say this is economical with the truth, to tell the truth, because the Electoral Commission has said that they're not taking a position on it, which I think is a rather unprincipled position for the Electoral Commission to take, but nonetheless it is not one which endorses George Galloway, and people should be clear about this. What we are trying to do is have negotiations with the other side, Respect Renewal, where we try to get an agreement where both of us can use the word respect with what is called a qualifier. In other words, they could be Respect Renewal, we could be Respect People Before Profit, or People Before Profit Respect. Now, let's hope we can get agreement on this kind of thing. If we can't, then at a certain point, because you have to register the name, we have to decide to have a different name. That will make it harder for us, but then again we have to do what we're doing in Leighton and Preston, which is we put Respect on the leaflets and we make sure it's connected with a new name. And in Leighton we've got Carol Vincent's name, who was going to call herself Carol Respect Vincent by deed poll, but luckily rather a kind of gobsmacking piece of news, isn't it? But anyway, eventually she didn't have to, or we hope she hasn't had to do that, and I hope I won't have to call myself Lindsey Respect German, because my middle name is Anne, and whatever the limitations of that, I think I'd rather stick with that. But these are things that we can get round. They're not helpful. It's not as we wanted it to be, but they are not things which are a barrier to us standing and doing very, very well. And that just brings me to the concluding point, which I'm sure everybody wants me to make. Is the crucial question is what we do now. And what we do now, we have 3 months to the day to do this election. 2 months up to when the nominations close, and then a month of the election itself. That's actually, on one level, it's a very short period of time. On another level, it's quite a lot of time on one condition, that we start from tonight, and that is the most important condition. So let's from tonight, if people have got queries or worries or so on, let's discuss them, but let's from tonight try and put these problems behind us, and let's make sure that we do push outwards. And I would like people from all the areas tonight, all the different constituencies, to try to meet at the end so that we can discuss what it is we do. You know, we don't want another week till we have an organising meeting, then another month till we have another meeting, and then suddenly it's Easter holidays and everybody's gone. We have to start now. That's point one. Point two, we have to get meetings in every area, and we have to select candidates if we haven't done that already in the constituencies. That is an urgent priority. Point three, we have to go to the press with our candidates and say our candidate stands for whatever we want to highlight, the local issues to do with housing, to do with transport, to do with all these things. We will get publicity over this. I mean, I get the feeling that actually in the local press in particular, people are absolutely bored with politics, and to be honest, the journalists are so overworked and understaffed that if you give them a press release with a picture, they nearly always put it in, and that is something we can get the publicity. Fourthly, we need to go to Leighton to give Carol and the comrades in Leighton and Waltham Forest all the support that we can. I think she's doing fantastically well, and I think this will be a fantastic shock to all the people who said that Respect was finished, that we will get a decent vote and we'll do very, very well with it. Finally, we are proposing a number of days of action where we want people to leaflet tubes, to go out and leaflet housing estates, to canvass, to do all these things. Please, in every area, draw up a list now. Plus, we have a sheet where we want people who are local trade unionists, local community activists, anyone who will support me or any of the other candidates in the election. Please make sure we get their names. We may not get, you know, the big celebrity names, although we'll get some of those. I'm pretty convinced we'll get some of those, but the main strength that we have is not whether we can convince a bunch of celebrities who don't do very much that they are going to support us between now and May. The real question is, can we convince those on the left, the ethnic minorities, the people who are suffering now from all the issues I've talked about, can we convince them that we have a serious campaign and that that campaign is up and running? That really is the task we have to take away from tonight. Thank you very much.